Hello, bonjour, buenos dias, ni hao, hello. Welcome to the Chapel in York Roundtable. I'm Sue Cunningham, President and CEO of the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. CASE is the membership organization for those who champion the successes of their institutions. CASE serves advancement professionals across all disciplines: fundraising, alumni relations, advancement services, marketing, and communications. Because CASE has a global membership in more than 80 countries, it gives me great pleasure to know these roundtables are occurring around the world. One of the core competencies that CASE espouses is global and cultural competence. As education is a global endeavor, intercultural understanding and communications are fundamental for success and advancement. I've had the great pleasure of living and working in 3 different continents during my career, and in each of my roles, I have spent significant time engaging with people from different countries and regions, all with the shared passion of advancing education to transform lives and society. The last year has proven to us that whether or not we are able to travel, our engagement with one another, in person or through other means, is vital. Relationships matter deeply in our work. I thank Chapel in York for its long relationship with CASE and for creating these opportunities for you to engage in robust discussion. Enjoy.
Welcome everybody to this Chapel in York fundraising roundtable. Today we're going to be looking at fundraising for education in a global world. I think if we see the world as a crystal ball, COVID has shaken it up and clouded everything. And as we watch the flakes fall, what has stayed the same and what is different? And I think we have all been working through trying to understand that, and people talk about getting back to normal, but will we get back to normal? And what will it be a new normal? What can we rely on and what will we need to change as we adapt and continue to find support for our organizations? I'm very honored and delighted to welcome as our lead speakers today, Stuart Krantz, who is Chapel in York's Vice President for International Fundraising. Welcome, Stuart. Nazima Mohammed, who is Executive Director of Inyatelo, the South African Institute for Advancement, and currently Deputy Chair at the University of Cape Town's Council. And Professor Becky Moyo of the newly established Wits Center for Philanthropy at the Wits Business School. Welcome and thank you. What we'll be looking today is, as fundraisers, continuing to look for domestic and cross-border support for our organizations, how do we respond to this new environment? How have we responded? What have we learned? And I think what advice can we give the leaders of our organizations? How can they best support us in our endeavor to attract investment and to bring advocacy for our causes? Stuart, if I might ask you to kick off, briefly introducing yourself and your experience in philanthropy and talking perhaps about making the case. Has the case changed? Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you, Adrian. It's a pleasure to be on this important roundtable at this key time for many organizations around the world. I'm president of International Fundraising for Chapel in York, and for the last few years, I have a background in fundraising that goes back over 2 decades for institutions in the United States, although I have done a variety of consulting around the globe over those 2 decades and worked with universities, schools, and other nonprofits in different sectors around the globe. Chapel in York works with organizations globally, and we do whatever we can and support these organizations in helping them fundraise around the world, not just by helping to manage and administer giving entities across borders, but also, as Adrian is sharing right now, working with them and actually helping them improve their fundraising. This is a particularly important time to think about that this past year, and as COVID continues in different parts of the world, to think carefully about how the pandemic is affecting and will affect our work as fundraisers and leaders at universities and higher education and in schools around the globe. So what we would like to I would like to just share for a few minutes before the other excellent speakers present is, given the current dynamic environment in educational fundraising around the world during the pandemic, during COVID, I think it's helpful to ask ourselves three important questions. Number one, has anything about the fundraising fundamentals changed? As Adrian so rightly said, are the principles that were sound before still sound? Or has there been a change in some fundamentals that we really need to think about in the fundraising environment? Number two, what changes are necessary right now to get the best results, fundraising results, during the rest of the COVID period? And this is relevant whether you have fundraised or whether your institution has fundraised for a long time or just started. That's not really that important. What's really important is, what can we do to get the best results given the current situation? And number three, can institutions use the experiences that they're going through at this time to improve their fundraising in the longer term? So let's think about these three questions around a couple of key themes and couple of key considerations. The first consideration really is cases for support. Adrian mentioned this. The question really is, for most institutions, is the case that you are presenting to potential supporters, both nationally and globally, is it important to think differently about that case now, given the pandemic? And I think that the obvious answer is yes. There's really two ways academic institutions globally in many ways have presented their case for support before and during the pandemic. Number one, they say, we're great, help us to be even better. That could be, in a nutshell. Or another way is, we're here to help solve the world's complex problems. And if you're thinking about which one to use now, it's pretty obvious that the second one is the one that's best suited during this time. So you might want to think, what are you sharing with potential supporters for your institutions? How are you thinking about presenting that? Are you saying, we're great, we're going to be great, or are we a problem-solving institution? And I think it's really important to sort of think about how you may be presenting that case. So it's a crucial time right now to review what your case is and address and make sure that the case addresses the concerns that are important to potential supporters right now. The second consideration is really around cultural understanding. This is something Chapel York thinks carefully about, because as a firm, we really help organizations with cross-border fundraising, cross-border philanthropy. And, not many organizations are, do enough, let's just say. Many organizations are thinking about cultural understanding of potential supporters, prospects, and donors, but you can always do more. And what this means is making sure, as you think about your strategy for cultivating potential supporters, are you really doing everything in your power to have the knowledge and background about the prospects and donors you're working with? How well are you thinking about these issues before you actually speak with them? If you work at a comprehensive university, there's a good chance also that you have experts in the cultures of the prospects that you are are working with. So you probably have people in your networks that can really help you think carefully about these things before you go about and working on your cultivation and solicitation efforts. So ensure your activities, also online activities, are culturally appropriate and focus on those. So we talk a lot with our clients about how to do that and do that well. The third consideration is really, what are your strategies that you're using? We talk a lot with academic institutions around the world. We try to think these things through with them to make sure that your strategies are spot on. And way we do that in a lot of ways is we try to mock up different settings so that anybody who's working in fundraising can carefully think about what it would look like from the prospect and donor's perspective. And we try to think very carefully about that. We don't assume that they understand everything that we're working on or that the organization or academic institution is working on. We think very carefully with the organization about what are we doing with the prospect and donor on a regular basis. The fourth is something that I think, and the fifth, both are what Adrian said, which is, how can we engage senior leadership and volunteers in the efforts that around fundraising, both during the pandemic and after the pandemic, in very proactive way? Be ready for online participation to stay permanent, and be open to increasing involvement of volunteers. This is volunteers and senior leadership. This is so important at this time. As you begin to think internationally about fundraising, it's so important not to forget that the larger the gifts that you want to receive, oftentimes are going to require senior leadership and volunteers to be engaged. So make sure to prepare your senior leadership to be as effective as possible in online and also in-person meetings, and make sure that the virtual experiences that you're creating with senior leadership is authentic and honest. It's something that we think a lot about at Chapel in York, and how to help organizations do that. I think it's, and finally, and then I'll turn it over, it's really important, we believe at Chapel in York, to try to maintain a sense of optimism during this time. And the first step that I think a lot of organizations go is, this is really difficult. This is terribly challenging. Are we going to be able to survive, and et cetera? We get it. We understand that. But I do think it's important that there's always a demand for education around the world. And alumni are starting to live everywhere, okay? And academic institutions in Africa and otherwise are playing a very important role and will continue to play a very important role in helping us get out of the pandemic, and then in the future as well. Institutions, probably the ones that you work with, are not just preparing students for a career. They train the next generation of leaders to confront these big problems. Pandemics are going to happen more than likely in the future too. So the question is, how can academic institutions play a role in helping us prepare and address these things? That goes back to the case, developing that case. Some of the greatest problem solvers are at academic institutions, and it's really important to sort of tap into those. So try to keep positive. Think in the longer term, the organization, institutions, and academics institutions that you work with are going to continue to play a really key issue going forward. So back to these early questions, has anything really changed? Are the principles that were sound still sound? Well, if you've been in fundraising for a while, you realize what I've shared is, yes, the principles are sound. And the organizations that have generally they're weak in donor and prospect engagement, they're the ones that are going to have the greatest challenge getting out of this. Those that are sort of thinking carefully about the issues now are more than likely going to get through this more successfully going forward. And can institutions use the experiences of these times to improve their fundraising? I think absolutely. And we urge at Chapel in York to start thinking about beyond just coping and surviving right now. If there's any way that you can think of this time as a key watershed moment in your in your academic institution's history, and be able to figure out how to change your business model around fundraising, I think that's probably going to help you in the longer term. Try not to not use this moment as a time to rethink how you fundraise, using technology in new ways, using senior leadership in new ways, using prospect identification in new ways. And I think all of us will get out of this, this pandemic stronger than we were before. I'll leave it at that. Back to you, Adrian.
Stuart, thank you so much. I think while you were talking, it brought me back to that, again, that understanding that organizations attract investment because we meet needs, not because we have needs. And I think we're looking at in a world that where needs are possibly changing, and to keep the donor acutely aware of what those needs are and how we as organizations continue to meet those needs and problem solve. Thank you so much, Stuart. Nazima, if I may move on to you. Welcome, Nazima. Thank you so much. If you'd like to give us a brief introduction and introduce, I think many people know you, but it would be lovely just to have that precede again, and then talk about Untitled and your experience as a self-funded nonprofit in yourself. What has your experience been? And then, of course, you are the umbrella for a number of member organizations and have perspectives into how they've responded and what sort of resilience they might have shown and the issues that they've come across. Thanks, Nazima.
Thanks, Adrian, and thanks, Stuart. It was such an insightful presentation. So I'm the Executive Director of Untitled. I've been there for a very short time, actually. It's 2 years and 9 months at the moment. My background really is in university transformation, looking at social justice issues in higher education, focus on institutional culture, policy development, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I've also worked as a program officer at the Ford Foundation, and so have some experience in grant making. Of course, lots of experience in grant seeking. And so I've come to Untitled partly, was brought on because of the university work that we do, and then found myself working a lot more closely with nonprofit organizations than I had in the past. And it's been an exceptional experience for me. It's been really interesting because it's kind of pushed me out of my own comfort zones and given me an insight into the difficult nature of resource mobilization in South Africa, not only from the nonprofit perspective, but specifically around university funding. And some of you may know that we run a survey called the Annual Survey of Philanthropy in Higher Education. We've done 6 thus far, and we continue to do so. Currently, only 11 universities are participating. Many of them don't have the data management systems in place around third stream income to be able to provide the data that we require to put together the survey. And the aim that Untitled has is to build that capacity. So I raised the Annual Survey of Philanthropy in Higher Education because I think it's really interesting around what is happening around income generation for universities in South Africa. It kind of provides insight into the deep structural challenges that we face as a country, leading on from apartheid and the legacy of that structural inequality in South Africa. And so the Annual Survey of Philanthropy, the results for 2018 2019 showed that we had generated in the 11 universities surveyed 1.61 billion South African rands. And what is really interesting about that is that out of that, we had most of the institutions who benefited were the historically advantaged universities. So you would have, and you know, in the report, Sean Jones, who does the report, refers to these universities as traditional universities. So they're not the comprehensives that have come with the restructured higher education landscape. Neither are they universities of technology. They are research universities by and large, and they are the large ones that have been fairly successful internationally as well. So we're talking about UCT, Stellenbosch, Pretoria, UKZN, University of KwaZulu-Natal, Pretoria University being the big five, as we call them. And the bulk of the funding for the 11 universities, at least 1.5 billion has gone to those five. And the rest have really struggled to obtain any funding. So we're talking about 100 million, I think, 101 million that has gone to universities of technology, one comprehensive and one historically Black university that's still remaining out of the historically Black or disadvantaged, as we call them, universities in South Africa. So if you don't know South African, you know, the shifts in higher education policy, the comprehensive universities and universities of technology were created to differentiate the mission and purpose of universities in South Africa on the one hand, but the other reason was also so that we could deal with the racialized legacy of higher education. And so you found historically Black universities merging with historically white universities to create a kind of a non-racial institution. And so what we're seeing, though, is that even with the merged institutions, the UOTs, Universities of Technologies and Comprehensives, that resource mobilization has been incredibly difficult. That we're seeing that philanthropies and trusts continue to give to who they know and who they feel comfortable with. And those are the big ones who have an international reputation. The other thing that we're seeing is that there have been shifts in funding. For the first 3 years of the survey, there was a balance in international funding versus local funding. And we've seen that post-2015, there's been a shift towards more local giving. So you're seeing that corporates in South Africa, corporate social investment has increased substantively, you know, in their giving towards universities, but then again to the traditional universities, as Sean calls them. And that fact is really interesting because I personally think, although we have to do the research to substantiate this, is that the Fees Must Fall protest movement, 2015 and onwards, had a significant role to play in the shift in giving. And so you see that corporate social investment increases dramatically after 2015, to the point where you have domestic giving superseding that of the internationals. And you're seeing that the bulk of funding goes into scholarships. So it's into student scholarships. And what I find fascinating, you know, in terms of my own background and my kind of insight into transformation, is that what was very specific about the Fees Must Fall campaign, although fees have always been an issue and the cost of higher education has always been an issue, you saw, you know, UCT and WITS playing a key role in the protest. And so you had, I believe, students, children of corporates who have their children at those big universities protesting because of the fee issues. We had, it was a dramatic campaign, which brought the country to a standstill, and it got us all to reflect. And so you see that the giving towards the traditional universities have increased, and in spite of us knowing that, you know, many of the remaining HDIs, historically disadvantaged institutions, the 8 remaining that are seen as traditional, are research universities meant to be, that they continue to struggle to attract funds. And the UOTs continued. They've been successful in attracting government funding and in you know, attracting funds from the sector-based education and training authorities. So if, you know, we had 1.6 billion from philanthropy, we had a further 3 billion coming from the sector education and training authorities, which specifically went more towards the universities of technology. And so that means that there is resource mobilization happening, but they're getting from what is really a government source, the Skills Development Fund, and not from individual grant makers and from philanthropies and from corporates in the same way as the advantaged universities. In the non-profit sector, it's been really fascinating. COVID has been dramatic. It has impacted on us in harsh ways. We've seen some close. We've seen us having to, Nyatelo included, having to make salary sacrifices because of the challenges last year in particular around attracting new income, as philanthropies were strategizing and thinking about what they were going to do. We really struggled, you know. Existing philanthropies gave to the existing grantees, and they didn't divert from that last year, except when it came to basic essentials for COVID. So, you know, around food and PPE and so on. And so organizations that weren't directly in the front line were impacted, right, quite dramatically. And if you didn't have an endowment or a reserve to keep you going, you were really wounded. And for me, one of the lessons, you know, I think that we kind of try to convey to the nonprofits is that you really have to do risk management. You really have to save for a rainy day. You know, when you do resource mobilization, that how you do your budgeting has to not compromise on putting away funding into a reserve fund. Because what has hit South Africa and what's hit many of our nonprofits is that wasn't the case. And so they've lost staff, they've lost premises, they've lost programming potential, and the communities that they serve have really been impacted. And we've seen that from several surveys. And I'm going on and on. I don't want to take up everyone's time, but that's pretty much, and I could, you know, if you ask more questions, I could respond to them later. Is that okay, Adrian?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you, Nazima. I do have some questions myself, and I'm sure we've got questions from the floor, but I'd like to move on to Becky, if I may. Becky is, Professor Becky Nkisi-Moyo is from an adjunct professor at the Wits Business School. Welcome, Becky, and thank you very much. If you'd give a brief introduction and some scope of this wonderful project you have of establishing the Center for African Philanthropy, as well as some of your research on Pan-African perspectives on cross-border giving. Thanks, Becky.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentations and insightful points from Nazima and Stuart. I think, you know, I'm located at the business school, sitting at a university, but at the same time, I'm running a center that depends very much on fundraising from outside sources, not from your normal university streams. And so I will be sharing some of my insights and experiences based on that. So I ran the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment. This was an idea that did not actually come from the academy, but it came from practitioners, especially foundations in Africa that were beginning to think about how to position themselves as a network. And so part of the thinking was we need to have a center that does research, that offers teaching on philanthropy and social investment in the continent, given that there actually was no center like ours in sub-Saharan Africa that offered, academic programs, research, and outreach activities. The only closest center to what we do is the Gerhard Center at the American University in Cairo, but it only does research. It doesn't do teaching. It doesn't do some of the stuff that we do. So from that perspective, we needed to close the gap, and so foundations and other partners saw the need to do that. And I was lucky to lead that process while I was still at Trust Africa, and then I moved on to the Southern Africa Trust, and then finally now I'm at the school. It's important to say that because, part of our offerings are both academic and professional. And so at a professional level, we offer short and executive courses, some of which include issues around leadership, fundamentals of fundraising, and resource mobilization, among others. We also do that at a certificate level, but at an academic level, we offer three programs. One is the postgraduate diploma, which actually I thought Nazima was going to talk about, because as part of their contribution to the sector, they approached us to work with them to develop a postgraduate diploma in resource mobilization. And we are starting that class this coming Saturday. It's been a long journey working with Inyatelo to actually do that. We also will be offering a master's program that has been approved and accredited by Coursework. We'll start offering that next year. But we are already, we have enrolled students who are doing masters by research, as well as PhD students. I think as of now, we have about 22 PhD students with us at the center that are focusing on philanthropy and social investment. We do research, which is important because, prior to the center, there was ad hoc research here and there, but it was mainly done by foundations, by nonprofits. And that was partly the reason why we thought a center located at a university would be important for purposes of producing research that is peer-reviewed, among others. And so we do that as well. So I think from the background of the center, that's what I can say. But the universities, just like VEST, have been seriously affected by COVID, and this has, changed the thinking around their attention and investment on resource mobilization. VEST, for example, is one of the universities that has always received, I would say, massive funding. But as a result of COVID, there were so many changes at the university, including, you would know that subsidies have gone down extensively. Student fees has also gone down as a result, not just of the protest, but just the question of affordability as a result of COVID as well. And so we have frozen a lot of things like, salary increments, major recruitments, among others. And so that's a reality that has hit the university. And so we are seeing everyone now across the university beginning to think about putting in place a fundraising strategy. Even at our school, at the VEST Business School now, I'm leading a working stream that focuses on fundraising opportunities. And we are using our centenary campaign as the rallying point for that. So one of the things that I do talk about when I talk to the leadership, whether I set the development and fundraising office or my own leadership at the school, is to tell them a bit about what are the trends in the continent around philanthropy and social investment. And so the first is that over the last couple of years, I would say probably more than 15 years now, there has been a slow but steady increase in the literature around African philanthropy. That wasn't the case before. And I think it's a major development because it begins to tell us, what are the trends, what's happening where, who is available, where we can easily now locate them. We can easily, have a database that says, here are the philanthropists in the continent, this is what they give, this is what they're interested in. We did not have that before. So that's important. The second point is that, philanthropy has also become very, very important when it comes to policy making. Before 2015, you wouldn't hear about philanthropy in policy circles. But from 2015 onwards, especially with the adoption of the SDGs, we began to see philanthropy moving slowly into the center in terms of policy making. And so it's not just about goal number 17 around partnerships, but it's also about what are philanthropists funding and reframing that with alongside the sustainable development goals. And so governments have realized that philanthropy is an important actor in their countries, whether local philanthropy or international philanthropy. And so they're beginning to tap into that. And what that has done is to create competition between nonprofits and governments for similar resources. If we look at the government of South Africa, Treasury and DST have ad hoc relationships with philanthropists, but they do lots of collaborations, especially in the areas of health, education, among others. You look at Rwanda, there's a government policy on how to engage philanthropy in the in terms of the priorities of the government. And I was lucky to actually write that policy for the government, so I can speak eloquently about it. The government of Liberia also put in place a secretariat within the president's office, and later it was moved to the planning commission. But again, it was supposed to come in and assist government in terms of its reconstruction and peace building initiatives. But of course, over time, I think if that secretariat is managed very well, it will morph into some of the future issues that are of importance for the government and the country. You go to government of Kenya, Uganda, Ghana, Zambia, they all have put in place what are called Philanthropy Sdg Platforms. And those platforms are a working relationship between government, the private sector, and philanthropies. So that triangle of success has emerged across the continent as one way of working. So I think that's the second trend that is important, the policy space and the role that philanthropy plays. And so if you are in fundraising and resource mobilization, we also need to look at some of the policy dimensions that universities could be focusing on, but also what philanthropists could be interested in and are able to support. The third dimension is the growth of different forms of high net worth individuals. And here, it would be good to segment them according to generations. So you've got your first generation type, your second, your third, and others. And they each approach resource mobilization differently. And I think it's important to know those traits. And what we are seeing is that the young entrepreneurs are interested in long-term sustainability. And so they're even willing to have conversations with universities. We are having some conversations with them now on shareholding, into startup businesses, into existing businesses. They are also interested in issues that have to do with the future, climate change, energy issues, innovation, among others. And so if you're thinking about raising resources from them, you have to think about what the future looks like and not what the present is about. But if you're thinking of the old, the first generation type and others, they also approach fundraising very differently. And I think there, maybe a lot of us have gained a lot of experience working with them. We know where they are located. We can even say, if you are looking for high net worth individuals, go to South Africa. In South Africa, go to Cape Town, go to Durban, go to Pretoria, Johannesburg. If you are in Egypt, go to Cairo. So we can plot that for you. But the young entrepreneurs are the ones that are fascinating. And I think they are the ones that hold the key for financing the future of the universities and other sectors, basically. And I think the final thing that I wanted to say is that the growth of philanthropy in the continent and that of social investment is also constantly changing and evolving with the context. And we saw during the COVID period that fundraising strategies had to adapt to COVID. If you're looking for sponsorships from corporates, you had to think differently this time around because their budgets were actually affected. So what are you looking for? Are you looking for money or are you looking for in-kind contributions? Are you looking for corporates to provide data for your students and employees? Are you asking them to provide equipment? asking them to provide case studies and leadership and all of those things, which you can monetize basically, but also to start thinking about innovative and alternative sources of financing that we have never thought belonged to the university setup. So I mentioned shareholding, but there's also lots around workplace giving. There's also a lot around voluntarism that I think is important. And I think Stuart mentioned this. Volunteers become the window to understand what exists in their spheres of influence and whether or not there could be potentials of matching grants, for example, especially from some of these companies. So scholarships still remain one of the preferred vehicles for companies, but I think there are new vehicles that are emerging that we should be thinking about. And that's the landscape that I think we're beginning to pull out. And so when I talk to my university, I ask ourselves, firstly, alumni is very important, but what does our alumni look like? Where are they located? Who are the ones that we should be focusing on? And we segment that so that we are not just bombarding everyone with massive newsletters and we don't get anything in return. The second is these corporates and these innovative sources of financing. The third is naming rights. So naming rights are very important for universities, but we have to think about the changes also in naming. Traditionally, it used to be you name a building, you name a program, but corporates are changing. They're now interested not just in the building, they're interested in what happens in the building or what happens around the building. So as you think about naming programs or naming buildings, think about what value that would bring to the corporate within, outside, and around the building, and not necessarily the building itself, because naming the building now is no longer the ideal for most corporates. They want to be seen to be doing something for society. So naming rights are very, very important. They still remain important for universities. And I think that's an area where corporates are, the ones that we are speaking to now, are saying to us, we want to be involved in this, but we want something that is of value. We just don't want to put our names on the building. We want to put our names around a program that solves issues around society. And in this case, innovation, climate change, energy, those are the things that are affecting the country right now in South Africa. If another COVID or pandemic were to hit the country, companies are looking to universities to see if during this time we've come up with innovations. We shouldn't be going back to study if another pandemic happens. So I don't know if that really does assist in the conversation, but I just wanted to cover those areas.
Becky, thank you very much. That was hugely interesting. And I think you covered that vast canvas enormously well with great insights. I have a lot of questions, but I'm aware we haven't heard from the floor. So I would like to ask our participants, and if you would be kind enough to unmute yourself and if you'd like to open your video and introduce yourself and ask any questions that you may have. Have we got questions? Then if there are a couple of questions I wanted to ask. Nazima, when you were talking about international, the 1.6 billion that you referred to coming in from philanthropic earnings, who were the donors? What was their profile? Individuals, philanthropies, trusts and foundations run by living individuals, or corporate like the Ford Foundation? What was the profile behind the 1.6 billion? Nazima, you unmute? Yes.
Sorry about that. About 48% of the funds of that 1.6 billion came from foundations and trusts. That's what we've garnered from the survey. The rest came from individual funders and then from corporate social investors in South Africa. If that helps answer the question. I'm just seeing if there's anything else I can tell you about it. So we're seeing that as I had indicated earlier, local donations increase. We have 50%, 56% of donor income emanated from local donors. And that was in 2016. In 2017, it was 72% from local sources and only 28% from international ones. And in 2018, we had 69% come from international donors, 31%. Oh, that figure's wrong. I think it's the other way. 69% from local donors and 31% from international donors. That's the figures that I have. Was there another question, Adrian? You're on mute now.
The 11 universities, those would be the sort of the universities that are in the top 11, ranked in the top 11.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Yeah,
but that are part of that survey.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. They're also institutions that we had. So I think this is an important point, that where leadership has played a role. It's you know, with Inyatelo under Sheila Gastro's leadership, had received funding from the Kresge Foundation, and we work collaboratively with at least 8 universities building advancement capacity in those institutions. And some of them have participated in the survey. And then, of course, there are those who already had established advancement practices in place who are part of our network and continue to participate in it. But where we, you know, there was a deliberate attempt to build advancement capacity because the concept was new to South Africa. We had been totally dependent on government funding and very little coming in, and student fees coming in, but with very little coming in from the corporate sector and from philanthropy. And so that process of building a new kind of ethos around what government keeps calling third stream and fourth stream income is new to South Africa, and there's been a lot of work around that. And Inyatelo has played a key role in that as well, with the Kresge Foundation.
It's what I found interesting was that the two triggers for people changing behavior have been crisis driven. So the fees must fall drove corporates to go, we want a society that is not built on student and young people's anger. It similarly reminded me actually of 1976 and how corporates responded in South Africa post 1976, and the whole opening up of the corporate sector to say, how do we maintain stability in this country? And it sort of just had resonance for me around that. And the second crisis point is obviously COVID. And I think for me, a message is you know, as somebody who's worked in alumni, and I think anybody who's worked in alumni will sympathize this, the continual message to leadership is, please don't let us approach our alumni for funds in a crisis. We have to have built and respected the alumni, their views. We have to create a fifth column, and giving is just one part of the way they interact. And I think this is, you know, it's a continual message, but, you know, one hopes one can move away from crisis driven, although clearly crises have their role, because it does change the way that gives people a shock and thinks we've got to change our thinking. The question I had for Becky, and one I'm interested in, there's a huge amount of wealth and resource in Africa. There are potentially very wealthy individuals in Africa who have the capacity to give philanthropically. And I was wondering, Becky, what your research on that is revealing. Is there, I know that people like Patrice Motsepe, of course, have set up his foundation, and he signed up to the Bill Gates rallying cry of giving away half of his wealth. So I was wondering, what are the trends across Africa? Has there been much research on that?
Yeah, there are a couple of research projects underway. We are conducting some. So we are looking at 30 countries right now and studying the trends on high net worth individuals. We are about to publish the findings. But there's also other groups like Bridgespan and others that have been looking at the behavior and trends of high net worth individuals. So essentially, we still see high net worth individuals giving more to their alumni or to their alma mater universities in the North than they give to African universities. So there's lots of data that shows how they give to London School of Economics, Harvard, and others. And partly that has to do potentially with visibility and other factors. The second is that if they do give to African universities, a lot of it has to do with the individual high net worth individual himself or herself, and not necessarily the foundation. So you'll find that the individual will give, maybe, I'm just using an example, to UCT, but the foundation might not even be aware until that is brought to their attention. And so I think that has to do with leadership of the universities and the leadership of or that high net worth individual. So you need to have very visible, but almost people-centered, driven, outgoing vice chancellors in order to get funding from high net worth individuals. I think we do have a couple that give to universities in Africa, but they are not the majority compared to how they give outside. There's also a trend of them giving directly to governments. In fact, the Bridgespan report shows that they are giving more to governments than they are giving to the nonprofit sector. We still have to understand the reasons behind that. I can't verify that, but that's the finding from Bridgespan. And I think there was a bit of anonymous giving to some universities of big grants from some of these individuals. So, only universities will know who those anonymous givers are. But certainly at VETS, we have had some anonymous gifts from some high net worth individuals. And again, it raises questions around, the culture of giving in the continent, and whether or not, that, giving has to be profiled, has to be made visible, or some prefer to just keep it anonymous and, not get everyone know what they are doing with their resources. But I think it's like I said in my input, it's a potential area of improvement, but it's not as easy as it is to raise resources from foundations and international sources. There's a lot of investment that needs to go into cultivating and getting funding from African high net worth individuals.
Thanks very much, Becky. I see Vera Adams. Vera, hello. I see you have a question for us. Perhaps Vera doesn't want to ask a question. Stuart, would you like to ask anything of our further to Nazima and Becky's outlines?
Yeah, so both presentations were excellent. I learned a great deal. Becky, in particular, you bring up so many important issues about prioritization for higher education fundraising on the continent. I think the question really is, what are the models, right, that universities are going to use in terms of implementing a proactive, sustainable fundraising model? And as you so rightly know and share, is that there are different types of models, and with limited resources, right? There's going to need to be a prioritization. The question is, are you going to focus on that? Are your universities going to focus on that tip of the pyramid, the very high net worth individuals, whether they're alumni or not, or well, probably or are you going to build sort of a long-term sustainable alumni relations program that will ultimately lead in years ahead, probably smaller gifts leading hopefully to larger gifts? There's data that shows that globally, it takes 10 years, more than likely, of gifts at a smaller amount to generate a seven-figure gift, let's just say, going forward, depending upon, the resource. So the question really is, in times of dramatic shift like this, how are universities going to adapt? Where are they going to put their attention? What are senior leadership going to focus on? And how are you going to measure a return on investment on any resources put towards higher education fundraising? I think this is the issue of the day. It's not only in Africa, obviously, it's at universities around the world. Where are they going to focus limited resources in terms of generating gifts? I do recommend, we recommend at Chapel in York, and I certainly do in my work, that universities that do have limited resources to put towards fundraising, that it's really important to focus on those prospects and donors that can make the biggest impact going forward. And something else you said, Becky, which I thought was spot on, which is, what are the giving opportunities? Basically, what are the cases that are going to generate the greatest philanthropic bang for the buck at this time? I mean, it's just the idea that universities are not focusing on that is a missed opportunity. I'll leave it at that. I thought both your presentations were fantastic. I think it's a lot of food for thought going forward, and I'll certainly be interested in following both of your work.
Thanks very much, Stuart. Nazima and Becky, would you like to add anything further?
So I will have to jump off at the top of the hour.
Okay, yes.
So for me, I mean, I think what Stuart is saying is, and I'm seeing this at least at VETS, and I'm assuming it should be the case in other universities. I think this is the only time that senior leadership is kind of called upon, and they've seen the importance of taking an active role in fundraising and resource mobilization. I think all along it has been seen as a task that can be done by the Advancement Office and others. But at this point in time, senior leadership realizes that they have to play a role. Otherwise, their universities are just going to dwindle and dwindle in importance. So they are learning. I don't think they've figured it out. They are learning as we go. Those that are lucky to have experts around them, they will be the ones that will succeed in this case. So that's the one. The second is that I think, in terms of thinking about what to do, especially now in a crisis moment, I think, leadership should really not lose focus of the bigger picture, because the crisis can easily force you to just focus on, interventions that are just for now, but they are not going to help you in the future. So I think adopting a sequencing and front-loading approach is what I think is important for me, which is, what are the things that you do now? Because like you said, they are likely to give you the greatest impact. So, in the formula around maybe 10% of the big donors that give you a big bang, you focus on those, but you use that to underwrite some of the initiatives that will become very handy in 10 years' time. Alumni relations. So we are beginning to hear people that came to Wits Business School in the early 70s, late 80s saying to us, we have never heard from you. When we hear from you, you are asking for money. What we want is just bring the class of 1980 together, and we have that nostalgic moment when we come together, and then something might come out of that, right? So we are beginning as the school to segment our alumni according to classes, and then inviting them for a community belonging exercise, which the head of school can do, and other senior leadership. So I think it's thinking about things that will underwrite initiatives that will then lead you in future, using the small, I would say, prospect that you have that gives you the greatest impact. So sequencing and front loading is what I would go by, for now. Thank you.
Super. Becky, thank you very much. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Nazima. Thank you all for attending. I think Stuart started the session by saying, have the principles changed? And really from our talk, being donor-centered, meeting needs, and capturing the imagination of who you want to engage, and above all, respecting the contribution of who they are, as well as what they can give. Those principles haven't changed. thank you very much, and I look forward to staying in touch and seeing how, Becky, particularly how your program grows, and Nazima within Untitled and Chapel in York's engagement in this whole area. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna, for your support. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian.
Great pleasure. Bye-bye.
Yeah.